So my name's, for those of you who haven't had the chance to meet yet, my name's Elliot. I'm a PhD candidate at University of Fabra in Barcelona. I'm very excited to be presenting what started as my first year PhD project, which is joint with a fabulous team of co-authors from which I've learned tremendously. And so in this work, we're studying the polarization of climate change attitudes. Let me tell you more about it and remind you of an important feature of American politics, just defining the last decades, which is this increase in political polarization. Lucy provided a very compelling picture of this yesterday in her own motivation. I probably should have included that here. And there's also some prior research that has shown this. Why is it important to have this in mind? Because polarization can hinder the formation of consensus that's needed to address climate change and also other types of pressing social challenges. Now, the interest of what we're interested in this paper is to look at external factors that can fuel polarization and could hinder the formation of a consensus. And we do so by studying how natural disasters impact climate change beliefs, as well as the media discourse around climate change. Why are we interested in this setting? Well, we think that climate change and natural disasters provide a pretty ideal setting to study this issue. Why is that? Because climate change is one of the most divisive issues in the US. As you see from this chart, protecting the environment and dealing with climate change are the two most divisive issues among 15 issues. On top of that, climate change has become more and more divisive issue in the US. And so this partisan divide on the reality of the impacts of climate change has increased. Now, we focus on natural disasters too because natural disasters can be interpreted in very different ways. Why is that? That's because there's a scientific consensus that climate change may lead to the increase in the severity or the frequency of natural disasters. But at the same time, it's very hard to attribute a specific disaster to climate change. There's actually a whole field in climate science called event attribution, which is interested in this. And so even among scientists, it's not clear whether a specific disaster is linked to climate change. And so this leads to the emergence of conflicting and competing narratives around natural disasters and how to interpret them. And so let me just give you examples of some of these narratives. I'm going to be showing you different headlines. This is taken from a left-leaning outlet, which implies that a specific natural disaster event, namely Hurricane Ian, was linked to climate change. And here's a different, well, the opposite narrative by the right-leaning outlet. What we're going to do in this paper, well, the first thing we're going to bring a very humble contribution, which is going to conduct an online survey to show that there is also the partisan divide in, well, the extent to which people attribute disasters to climate change. So we're going to elicit first and second order beliefs about the causes of Hurricane Ian through an online survey. And then we're going to move on to the main part of our main empirical exercise, which is estimating the impacts of disasters on climate change beliefs by combining two different data sets, an administrative data set of disasters in the US, as well as a large-scale electoral survey, the same one that Edgar was telling us about this morning, the CES. And then we're going to try to peer into some of the mechanisms, and namely media coverage that may exacerbate these divisions in public discourse. And we're going to look at partisan differences in both the amount of coverage as well as the content of coverage. We're going to be using LLMs to get at specific parts of content. Let me give you a preview of the results. In this online experiment, we show that liberals and conservatives differ in the likelihood they are to attribute a specific disaster to climate change, and they are very much aware, even tend to exaggerate this divide when we look at second-order beliefs. The second important finding is that disasters widen the gap between liberals and conservatives. So we showed that there's an increase among liberal respondents, but there's this backlash effect of conservatives. We also show that there is a divide in how the media covers disaster events in relation to climate change, both in the amount and in the content of coverage. And then we try to move on and to dig deeper into whether media coverage may be shaping people's environmental beliefs, and we have some suggested evidence of this. We're still trying to work on this, and I can talk about this a little later. So let me move on to the first exercise we have, which is conducting this survey to try to elicit people's likelihood to attribute a specific disaster event, namely Hurricane Ian, which happened in September 2022 in Florida, to climate change. What we do is that we conducted this online survey with 400 respondents, with an equal share of conservatives and liberals in a little less than a year following the event. What we do is that we just show a 1-minute video that depicts the devastation that's caused by this event. And then we ask several questions. We ask two, we want to have, we don't want to prime respondents into thinking about climate change straight away. So we ask two open-ended questions. The first one being, what are the associations that come to mind when you watch the video? And the second one being, what do you think the potential causes of the disaster were? And then we go and we actually explicitly ask them, do you think the cause of the disaster was climate change or nature's unpredictability? Based on what we had found in our pilots on what came up most often in the open-ended questions. And then we ask them, we are picking a random respondent from the opposite ideology from you. What do you like? How do you guess that person responded to the previous question on the causes? Do you think they replied it was climate change or nature's unpredictability? To try to get at second-order beliefs. Yeah.
I mean, this is Florida, right?
Yeah.
So Florida has hurricanes a lot. So are you saying that's not really a right answer? So this could be another hurricane, like you would have in the 1960s, or
isn't the truth both?
Yeah.
Is it what?
Isn't the truth both?
Yeah, the truth is both.
Right. That's precisely what's interesting. The truth could be both, but what people's perceptions are going to be depends on their partisan affiliation, on their self-reported ideology.
What's the science here? I mean, is climate change causing more hurricanes, or?
So the science says that overall, on aggregate, it's causing more hurricanes, more natural disasters, and more severe ones. But
this could be one that could have occurred.
Exactly. Or before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, and so in blue you see the so let's focus on the two first objects. That's the average of liberals or conservatives that mention climate change in the open-ended answers, and you see that there's this divide. The divide actually increases when we make it more explicit what we're looking after, and namely when we're priming them to think about climate change. And you see when you compare the fifth to the fourth object, you see that people tend to, well, they're very much aware of this ideological divide when they're asked to guess what an opposite ideology respondent would have responded, and there's also some signs of overestimating that gap.
Sorry, how do you ask that question? What is the question exactly?
So the question is, it's incentivized. We're saying we're going to pick a random respondent from the opposite ideology.
So you say opposite ideology or political ideology or...
Let me go to the...
Sorry, it's just to understand whether it is actually overestimating or when they think of something else under ideology.
We told them who identifies as liberal or can't remember whether it's liberal conservative or whether it's Democrat Republican. I think it's liberal conservative.
Because they might be thinking of something else when you ask opposite ideology.
Right, but it's not that. It's not that. Yes.
Do you have any way to like make sure that it's not just like social desirability bias, or is that actually theoretically interesting for you? Because in a way, like you could say this is interesting that like liberals are saying this because maybe they they see your study, so they want to kind of align with what you want them to say, and then the conservatives know that this is a study that goes, like.
All right. So the question is incentivized. So I think that rules out some of the biases you might have in mind. Yeah.
How is it incentivized? What do you mean?
We told them if you guess correctly, we'll give you we'll select a random respondent's amount of correct guesses, and we're going to give that respondent, that randomly selected respondent, a gift card of $100 on Amazon. That we did. I think this is standard. Lucy could probably corroborate on that. Okay, now.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
My last question. How do you introduce the study?
To them?
Yeah.
What do you mean?
What do you tell them about your survey? What you're studying, what you're after?
Oh no, we don't tell them anything about that. We tell them, look, you're just going to be answering a battery of questions, social demographics. These people, so this is conducted on Prolific. People use it to this type of studies. And then we just tell them, you're going to watch this video, and then we're going to ask you some of the questions of what you thought about the video, right? Okay, so to make it clear, in the paper, we're not making such a huge deal of this. It's a fairly minor contribution, and it makes it evident that we're just documenting that there is a partisan gap in the likelihood of people attributing specific disasters to climate change. The core of the paper is what I'm going to be telling you right now, which is the impacts of natural disasters on people's climate change beliefs. We use two different data sets for this. The first one being the universe of disasters that were declared by the Federal Emergency Management Agency. So we take all the disasters that happened between 2000 and 2021, have around a little more than 2,500 events, most of them being, well, I'll tell you more about this later. We have information on the exact start date of the disasters and when they impacted the counties that were affected by the disaster type, some information on the amount of relief that was assigned for relief. We link that to the cooperative election study, which you're now familiar with if you attended Edgar's presentation this morning, which is a nationally representative survey conducted online. We study some of the exact same questions that he studies, namely questions on, well, the intensity of climate change concerns, as well as preferences for climate change versus, for the environment versus jobs. And then we're going to construct this index of these two variables to make things just more tractable in the paper and in the presentation. I'm just going to show you what the raw data looks like. And so you're gonna see that, so in blue is the responses from respondents who were interviewed 4 weeks after a local disaster hit their county. And in gray are those of respondents who were interviewed 4 weeks before. And what we'll be following, I'm always going to be comparing these two different sets of respondents, people who were interviewed 4 weeks after a disaster hits their local county, and people who were interviewed 4 weeks before. And you see that there's, for Liberals, there's a change between people who respond answers 3 and 4, so sort of like mild intensity towards 5, so they're increasing the importance they're placing on climate change following a disaster, whereas for Conservatives, you're seeing a shift from 4 to 5, so the higher answers towards 2 to 1. This also holds for preferences for the environment versus jobs questions, which ask, well, to what extent you would, you place more importance on the environment versus importance over jobs, and we find similar patterns. So this is in the cross section. These differences could be driven by several things that are unobserved, and so we put a bit more structure on this exercise. And we're going to compare in the following, in our empirical strategy, respondents living in the same county with similar sociodemographic characteristics who happen to be interviewed immediately following a disaster versus immediately preceding a disaster. And we're going to do two things. The first one, so in the first equation in black, is the aggregate average effect of being affected by disaster on climate change beliefs. And then we're going to allow for heterogeneous effects along self-reported ideology. What's the main identifying assumption? It's that the timing of interviews is as good as random with respect to the timing of local disasters. We provide some evidence for this, namely that people's self-reported ideology does not change much following a disaster in their county. Also, it's important to keep in mind that the CES is conducted online, so that limits concerns of the rollout of the survey being affected by the disaster itself. What are the results? I'm going to go through these 3 different outcome variables, which are going to be displaying the same pattern, namely that if you look at the first column, on aggregate, there doesn't seem to be an effect on, well, climate change beliefs of respondents do not change following a disaster, but that this null aggregate effect can be explained by the heterogeneous response of respondents along ideological lines. Namely that liberal respondents tend to increase the importance they place on the environment versus jobs, whereas conservatives display this backlash and tend to think that the jobs are becoming more important than the environment. Yes, please.
Elliot, how do you explain the interaction with conservative? Like for me, it's okay that liberals become more pro-environment after the shock, but I don't understand like why conservatives should backlash.
Right. So I'm going to be talking about this more later and giving some evidence in the penultimate slide. But essentially, what we think is happening is that a disaster is going to make the issue of climate change salient and top of mind for people in the public debate, and people are going to fall back on their prior beliefs. Okay?
Yeah.
It's an increase in CG in the model that I showed. It's exactly this prediction.
But there is another story that is societies could become more polarized after a disaster. So it could be that this is just a reflection that people are coming apart alongside dimensions that are heavily polarized in the first place. So maybe you're gonna show it to us, but how would this look like on other polarized issues?
Like you're thinking about abortion, immigration,
Exactly.
so we're not going to find much differences in those other in those other policy issues, which are not made salient by a disaster, right? A disaster does not, mass shootings would make gun issues salient. I don't know, a refugee crisis may make immigration salient, whatever. But we're not finding increases in those other dimensions because we're looking at impacts of natural disasters. I'm gonna, so if I have time, I'll show you the graph that's related to that. Yes, please.
So I think the important question would be knowing whether the update of the conservatives would have happened without the update of the liberals. So is it just a reaction? They anticipate that the reactions are going to learn this from the disasters, so they now counteract what the liberals are doing.
Right,
So I mean, probably in some experiment you can manipulate.
yeah, so we want to do an experiment to understand these mechanisms more. It's fairly hard to do with observational data. I'm gonna be able to give you some evidence of what's driving this backlash, but I would take it as suggestive. Yeah, and I'll come back to that right at the end. Yes, please.
Do you have a coefficient or something like do you have a control for wealth? So I was thinking about insurances, because that's very scary in the US. If your area gets like, coded as like natural, natural disaster area or whatever, that has like huge financial consequences on your mortgage and everything else.
Yeah.
Especially for like wildfires recently and stuff like that. So I think it would be interesting to see if they're a house owner or a renter and like wealth, if you have that, but I don't know if you have.
Right, so we don't have wealth, we don't have information on assets. We know their income. So we in brackets, and we control for that.
Yeah, because that would be quite interesting just to see the coefficient on like how,
Right.
if you have any
Right.
results in that.
Okay, yes, please.
Sorry, not to keep, feel free to completely ignore
Yeah,
this, but do you know anything about kind of views on mitigation versus adaptation? Because your initial graphs,
Yeah.
to me, seem to suggest that maybe conservatives are not that much against adaptation, but more against mitigation. And maybe these outcomes that you have sort of just grouping that together, and I think those two beliefs might be fundamentally different.
Yeah, so I think these beliefs proxy for, generally speaking, like the importance that people place on the environment or climate change as an issue. There are some questions, so I'm returning the question I asked Edgar this morning to myself, building on what you were saying. There are questions on whether respondents support regulatory changes around these issues, and we don't find much polarization or even substantial changes on those lines. And we're trying to think about those and maybe doing an experiment. So the way these questions are actually asked in the survey, a bit where they're referring to very specific policies that were in place, and maybe respondents don't have a lot of knowledge about those, so these could be noisy. And we're trying to do more about that in a survey.
And as a result, very similar. Did they present here, maybe in the environment campus, this paper by Javad Shamsi and other people? So they looked at the response to marches for climate.
No.
You know what I'm talking about?
No, I don't know the paper.
So they use variation in rainfall in order to look at the turnout for that. And then they look at, these happened just a while before the European election. And they look at the green vote and the radical right vote. And it has precisely this pattern. Green vote goes up because the issue is more salient.
Right.
See an interpretation, and there's a backlash of the radical right vote goes up.
So I don't think we're signing that paper, so I'll come back to you for that afterwards. Chomsky.
Is Javad a co-author on that? Or?
I think so.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
One final question. I was thinking about repeated disaster shocks. So do repeated disaster shocks make people double down on their existing ideology? Or does it help them update? So for conservatives, if they find many negative shocks, do they update on their beliefs about climate change and vice versa for liberals?
This is what I'm looking for. We actually looked into this. And so we separate respondents living in counties that were affected by I think more than 5 disasters, or no, maybe more than 2 disasters in the past 2 years, versus the other respondents. And we show that the pattern is driven by people who are not exposed a lot to disasters. And so this could have consequences for how we think about, how people are learning and updating their beliefs about climate change. Yes.
Another question. Do you do a falsification test with things like earthquakes that are for sure not generated by climate change?
So no, we don't, because earthquakes are very rare events, and the CES happens between September and November. So most of the disasters that enter our data set are hurricanes or very violent storms, which are related to climate change. What we do, though, is a placebo check where let me check this, where we do 1,000 random draws of fictitious disaster dates, okay? And then we plot all the coefficients, which you see here in the histogram of each of these draws, and in the red line is our coefficient for the increase in the gap between liberals versus conservatives, okay? And so that goes through, and that answers your question. When these effects that we're finding are not due to pure chance or pure luck, right?
No, I don't think it answers my question, because my question was more, are people just aligning with whatever the party is saying? And not the party is really raising, awareness about climate change, and so I'm responding to that. I'm just mirroring what they're doing.
Right.
Versus they become concerned themselves. That was kind of my.
Right.
I was hoping that
So
around other events, this discourse would come back up.
Yeah. So it's hard for us to give an answer to this. We thought at one point about looking into politicians' communication on climate change, but then it becomes really hard to disentangle what's coming from respondents themselves, purely demand-driven effects, from like the political supply side effects. But thanks for the question. Okay, so I think I went over some of the things that I wanted to tell you about on this slide, which is mostly about robustness and additional results.
Quickly go on the timing. So you said 4 or 5 weeks.
Yeah, so these event studies are a little bit wobbly, especially there could be some anticipation that's happening. But if you take these overall, we do definitely find that there's an increase in the 4 or 5 weeks following a disaster for liberals and to some extent for conservatives. Yeah, yes, please.
So the story you're telling us is the one of like the recent wildfires in California, where like the liberals are like, this is climate change, and then Trump is like, no, it's like the whatever Californian elite not giving us water that's stuck in Northern California or something, right? Like you're going to choose like the explanation like according to like your political identity. You're either going to believe this is climate change, or you're going to say, no, it's some kind of like water elite story that has nothing to do with climate change. Is that kind
So
of?
it could be motivated reasoning. It could be, you get persuaded by the political party itself. It could be tons of different things that I still think with our data, we're not able to answer, and we would need probably an experiment to look more into this.
Observational data. I mean, it would be very interesting to have what you said, like communications.
Yeah. But you need to have a sense of, to try to disentangle, the intentions of what's driving people's choices. And I think you could probably only get at this through an experiment. I mean, these surveys typically don't go into so much detail into what drives the responses on specific answer items. Okay, so let me, with the 10 minutes that are left, go into this third part of the analysis, which is more trying to shed light on what's happening on the media. Maybe this will answer some of the questions that are lingering around. So let me tell you first about the media data set that we put together. Essentially, we're looking at local newspapers that we take from two different news aggregators, Newsbank and ProQuest, over the same study period. We have information on the full text of articles, their exact date of publication, as well as the county where the newspaper is headquartered. And we map that to have a proxy for newspaper ideology. So essentially, we take the Republican vote share in the county where the newspaper is headquartered as a proxy for newspaper ideology. We're going to show robustness for different proxies of newspaper ideology, namely the Gentzgau and Shapiro slant measure. And we're going to perform the same type of exercise, which is comparing newspaper coverage in the 4 weeks after the county where the newspaper is affected by natural disaster versus the 4 weeks before. We're going to be using two different corpora of articles. First one, which is related to disaster coverage, so we just do a keyword query. We take all the articles in that sample of newspapers that mention a keyword related to a disaster. And our second corpus is about climate change coverage, where we do a similar thing, but for climate change related keywords, so climate change or global warming. And the first result we have is on the sheer amount of news coverage. So we're simply able to show that following a disaster, in the 4 weeks following a disaster, counties, regardless of whether they are located in a Republican or a Democrat leading area, increase their coverage of a disaster. That's not very surprising. It's also a good sanity check on our method, but that there is this difference between Democrat based newspapers who are increasing their coverage about climate change, whereas there's no change for newspapers that are located in Republican leading counties. We try to go a bit deeper into what content these newspapers are providing, and the way we do so is that we take all the articles within that 4 week window, so 4 weeks before and 4 weeks after, that mention both the climate change related keyword and disaster related keyword, and we annotate them through GPT. We do so because GPT now provides a very good instrument and tool to do things that are not possible to do with standard natural language processing techniques. Specifically, we're going to ask two questions about narratives, namely, does the article imply a causal connection between climate change and disaster occurrence? And then a question about, does the article negate the causal connection between climate change and the disaster? Then we're going to ask a question about stance. So does the article imply that climate change is an important issue? And a question about tone. Does the article use sarcasm when discussing the issue of climate change? We do some validation. I can talk about that more if you want offline. Just going to go through the results. Essentially, we showed that newspapers that are located in more Republican-leaning counties tend to produce less articles that make the connection between natural disasters and climate change. They tend to produce more articles that negate this causal connection or that use sarcasm. That's in the 4 weeks that follow a disaster. And now this is the last result slide, which is trying to link these, the media coverage that newspapers make of natural disasters and climate change to the changes in environmental beliefs. And so this is simply suggestive evidence that in places where in counties where there is at least one newspaper headquartered, that's where we see the polarization in environmental beliefs. In places where there's no newspaper coverage, we don't see any action happening. That's the first element that speaks to the media potentially driving some of these results. And the second element is this one. We separate counties by whether the coverage dedicated to climate change is low or high, so above or below the median. And we show that liberals tend to increase the importance they place on climate change only in places where there is low coverage dedicated to climate change. And we observe that conservatives display the backlash in places where there's high climate change coverage. And so I think this links to the fact that people are reacting to either a counter narrative or something that's making it salient to them that they want to disagree or distance themselves from what they're observing. Yes, please.
Comes to mind the paper by Snyder and Stromberg, JP 2000, where they have used the asynchronization between media markets and geographical areas. And if you wanted to probe, how much is running through the media that people have access to, that would be cool to exercise. But now they do states.
They do states and probably
they do counties within states, whereas you do county as your unit of analysis, so maybe harder, but there's some ideas there.
So I can't remember whether we tried this, but I need to go back into what we did on that. I think this was at one point we discussed doing this. I can't remember whether we did it or not. Yes.
Does the mean of the dependent variable mean that 14% of articles in COM4 mention climate change? So could it just be a space constraint in places where they already talk a lot about climate change? There's just needs to be some space for sports and other stuff.
So let me know whether you're reading this correctly. That the dependent variable here is the index on environmental views. That's a standardized variable. It's not saying anything about climate change coverage.
Oh, I see. But it's gonna be the content of the newspaper, no?
Yes, we're just doing this a sample split, right, between respondents who live in counties where there's high climate change coverage, fourth column, and respondents who live in places with low climate change coverage. And we're just looking at the changes in environmental views following the disaster. And the environmental views is our dependent variable. It doesn't have a strong interpretative value because it's standardized.
So I missed your interpretation. So what this is saying is that if the newspaper doesn't speak about climate change in general, then only liberals react to and if it does speak a lot about climate change, then only the conservatives react.
Right, exactly. So I think this speaks to the absence of persuasive effects of coverage. I mean, all of this is extremely suggestive. I would take it with a grain of salt, right? But if I were to take out something from it, I think it points to the absence of persuasive effects and more of a reaction towards coverage that you are not aligned with.
Mm-hmm. But that explains the conservative one. But what's
also for the liberal backlash, right? If they're probably
you should be writing about this.
You should be writing about this. Yeah, they'd be expecting this, and so that backlashing against that. I mean, they're reacting against that. Yeah. Sure. Okay, so just taking stock. So what we show in the paper is that when you experience a disaster, there is there's a heightened partisan divide around climate change attitudes. And one of the possible interpretations is that, well, disasters make the topic of climate change salient. It's at the top of people's minds, and that triggers well, conflicting narratives, or people fall back on their prior beliefs. This has implications in the real world, namely that trying to build a consensus on climate change in the aftermath of a disaster may sometimes backfire. Thank you.